The room is silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. It's March 15th, 2020, and 12 people sit around a polished mahogany table in Washington, watching global markets collapse in real time on wall-mounted screens. The Dow has just plunged nearly 3,000 points. Oil prices are in freefall. Credit markets are seizing up. Outside this building, Americans are panic buying toilet paper and canned goods, unaware that inside these walls, a decision is being made that will inject more money into the economy in a single weekend than was spent during the entire first year of World War II. The chairman leans forward. His voice is steady, almost eerily calm. "We're going back to zero," he says, "and we're buying everything. Within 72 hours, the Federal Reserve will purchase more assets than most countries produce in a year. The printing presses, metaphorically speaking, will run without pause." And here's what nobody says out loud in that room. What cannot be said. This crisis is not an aberration. It is oxygen. It is purpose. It is, in the most uncomfortable sense imaginable, exactly what was needed. Because here is the question that haunts the marble halls of every central bank from Frankfurt to Tokyo, the question that keeps governors awake at night and defines the very paradox of their existence. What is a central bank without a crisis to solve? What is a fire department in a world without fires? The machinery of monetary policy, the vast apparatus of emergency lending facilities and quantitative easing programs and forward guidance, all of it sits idle during times of stability, like a surgeon with no patience, like a general with no war. And when stability persists too long, when markets function smoothly and credit flows freely and inflation remains dormant, something dangerous begins to happen. Questions emerge. Why do we need these institutions? Why do unelected technocrats control the money supply? Why does the Federal Reserve operate with such sweeping authority, yet remain immune to the democratic process? These are the questions that arise in the calm, in the boring prosperity that central banks theoretically exist to maintain. But when crisis strikes, when the financial system teeters on the edge of collapse, when ordinary people watch their retirement accounts evaporate and businesses shutter and unemployment lines stretch around city blocks, suddenly the central bank transforms from a mysterious bureaucracy into a savior, from an abstract concept into the only force standing between civilization and chaos. To understand how we arrived at this moment, to grasp why central banks have become crisis-dependent organisms, we need to travel back to a different era, to a world where the very concept of a central bank was viewed with suspicion bordering on hostility. Picture America in the 19th century, a sprawling nation of farmers and merchants, of frontier towns and industrial cities, a country deeply skeptical of concentrated financial power. They had seen what the Bank of England represented, how it served the interests of monarchs and aristocrats, and they wanted no part of that system. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, fought the Second Bank of the United States with the fury of a man facing down an existential threat. "The bank is trying to kill me," he declared, "but I will kill it." And he did. For decades, America operated without a central bank, relying instead on a chaotic patchwork of private banks, each issuing their own currency, each subject to runs and panics with predictable regularity. It was messy. It was unstable. But it was also, in the eyes of many, free from the corrupting influence of central authority. Then came 1907. The panic began, as these things often do, with a failed speculation scheme. Two financiers attempted to corner the market on United Copper Company stock. The scheme collapsed. Panic spread. Bank after bank faced runs as depositors demanded their money. The stock market plunged nearly 50%. Credit evaporated. Without a central bank to inject liquidity, to serve as a lender of last resort, the entire financial system teetered on the brink. Enter J.P. Morgan, already the most powerful financier in the nation, who effectively functioned as a one-man central bank. He locked the city's leading bankers in his library and refused to let them leave until they pledged enough money to stabilize the system. It worked but barely, and in the aftermath, a terrifying realization settled over America's political class. They had just witnessed the entire economy held hostage by the whims of private bankers. Something had to change. The crisis had created the political will, the absolute necessity, for what had previously been unthinkable. 6 years later, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was born not from careful planning in times of prosperity, but from panic from the ashes of financial catastrophe. And here is where the pattern establishes itself, where the template is set for the next century of central banking. The Federal Reserve spent its early years learning, experimenting, making mistakes. Through the 1920s, it maintained relatively loose monetary policy, helping fuel the stock market bubble that would eventually burst in spectacular fashion. When the crash came in 1929, the Fed made what is now widely considered one of the greatest policy errors in history. Instead of flooding the system with liquidity, instead of acting as the lender of last resort it was designed to be, the Fed allowed the money supply to contract by a third. Banks failed by the thousands. The Great Depression descended like a fog, transforming an ordinary recession into a decade-long catastrophe that would reshape the social contract between citizens and government. And yet, even in this failure, perhaps especially in this failure, the Federal Reserve's power grew. The crisis gave Franklin Roosevelt the political capital to fundamentally restructure the American financial system. The Banking Act of 1935 reorganized the Fed, centralizing authority in Washington, giving the Board of Governors unprecedented control over monetary policy. Crisis had not diminished the institution. It had strengthened it. If stories like this fascinate you, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more hidden chapters of history to light. Fast forward to August 1971, to another closed-door meeting, this time at Camp David. President Nixon has gathered his economic advisors for a weekend that will change the global monetary system forever. The problem is straightforward. America has been running deficits to fund the Vietnam War and Great Society programs. Foreign governments are demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings, as is their right under the Bretton Woods system. But the United States doesn't have enough gold to meet these demands. The emperor, quite literally, has no clothes. The solution Nixon chooses is radical. He closes the gold window, unilaterally ending the convertibility of dollars to gold, effectively destroying the monetary system that had governed the world since 1944. It is, by any measure, a crisis, a moment of profound uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, in that chaos, the Federal Reserve and other central banks gain something extraordinary. They're freed from the constraint of gold, liberated from the need to maintain fixed exchange rates. They can now create money without limit, bounded only by the abstract concept of inflation rather than the concrete reality of metal reserves. The crisis, once again, expands their power and discretion. The 1980s brought inflation, and with it, Paul Volcker, the most consequential Fed chairman since the institution's founding. He arrived at a moment of genuine crisis, when inflation was running above 13%, when the dollar was collapsing, when Americans were losing faith in their currency. Volcker's solution was brutal. Raise interest rates to levels that would deliberately trigger a recession. The prime rate hit 21%. Unemployment soared above 10%. Farmers protested outside Fed buildings. Builders mailed 2x4s to the Fed in protest of crushed housing markets. But Volcker held firm, and eventually inflation broke. The crisis gave him the political cover to do what would have been impossible in normal times, to inflict short-term pain for long-term stability. And when it worked, when inflation collapsed and the economy roared back in the mid-1980s, the Federal Reserve emerged with something it had never quite possessed before: genuine credibility. The crisis had been painful, but it had proven the institution's value. Then came the era that would define modern central banking, the period when crisis response evolved from occasional necessity into core institutional identity. October 1987. The stock market crashes 22% in a single day, the largest one-day percentage decline in history. The newly appointed Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, responds swiftly, flooding the system with liquidity, making clear the Fed stands ready to support the financial system. Markets stabilize within days. Wall Street learns a powerful lesson. The Federal Reserve will not let them fail. This becomes known, mockingly, affectionately, fearfully, as the Greenspan put, the implicit promise that the Fed will intervene to prevent any major market decline. And with this promise, with this crisis response, something fundamental shifts. The central bank is no longer simply managing the money supply and setting interest rates. It has become the guarantor of asset prices, the ultimate backstop for financial markets. The 1990s see this pattern repeat. The Mexican peso crisis of 1994. The Fed helps orchestrate a bailout. The Asian financial crisis of 1997. The Fed cuts rates. The Russian default and long-term capital management collapse of 1998. The Fed orchestrates a private sector bailout and slashes interest rates. The dot-com bubble bursts in 2000. The Fed cuts rates to 1% and leaves them there for years. Each crisis brings intervention. Each intervention creates moral hazard, the expectation of future bailouts. Each expected bailout encourages greater risk-taking. Greater risk-taking eventually produces greater crises. The cycle feeds on itself, a spiral of dependency where markets expect rescue and central banks need markets to need rescuing. Because here is what Alan Greenspan understood, what every central banker since has understood but rarely states explicitly. The worse the crisis, the more essential the institution becomes. During calm periods, the Fed operates in the shadows, adjusting interest rates by quarter-point increments, issuing dense statements parsed by analysts, gradually fading from public consciousness. But during crisis, the Fed occupies center stage. Its chairman appears on television, explaining complex interventions to anxious citizens. Congress grants it emergency authorities. Presidents defer to its judgment. The institution is no longer questioned. It is needed, desperately, urgently needed. And this need translates into authority, into resources, into the expansion of mandates and tools and power. September 2008 brings the ultimate test, the financial crisis that will define a generation. Lehman Brothers collapses. Credit markets freeze. Money market funds, considered safer than banks, begin to break the buck, meaning investors cannot retrieve their full principal. The commercial paper market, which funds the day-to-day operations of major corporations, seizes up entirely. We are, without exaggeration, days away from the collapse of the global financial system, from ATMs going dark, from the overnight failure of the modern economy. And into this void steps the Federal Reserve, led by Ben Bernanke, a scholar of the Great Depression who has spent his academic career studying exactly this type of crisis. The Fed's response is unprecedented in scope and creativity. It doesn't just cut interest rates to zero. It begins buying treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities, eventually trillions of dollars in assets through quantitative easing. It creates emergency lending facilities with names like the Commercial Paper Funding Facility and the Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility, programs that would have been inconceivable months earlier. It extends swap lines to foreign central banks, ensuring the entire world has access to dollars. It purchases securities that no one in the private sector will touch. And alongside the Fed, the Treasury Department engineers bailouts of banks, insurance companies, auto manufacturers, effectively nationalizing large portions of the economy. The scale of intervention is staggering. The Fed's balance sheet explodes from under $1 trillion to more than $4 trillion. Money is created through keystrokes, through digital entries in computer systems, sums that dwarf anything in human history. And it works barely just enough. The system stabilizes. Markets recover. The economy begins growing again. But what emerges from this crisis is not the same financial system that entered it. The Federal Reserve now owns a vast portfolio of assets. It pays interest on bank reserves, effectively setting a floor under short-term rates. It issues forward guidance, promising to keep rates low for years. It has become, in ways both explicit and subtle, the central manager of the entire economy, making decisions that affect employment, housing prices, stock valuations, the distribution of wealth itself. And here is where the paradox becomes inescapable. The Fed's success in responding to the 2008 crisis creates the conditions for future crises. Interest rates stay at zero for 7 years. Asset prices inflate to extraordinary levels. Investors, desperate for returns in a zero-rate world, take ever greater risks. Corporations borrow trillions to buy back stock. Private equity firms lever up companies to unsustainable levels. Subprime lending reemerges, not in housing, but in auto loans, student debt, corporate bonds. The financial system becomes addicted to cheap money, dependent on the Fed's continued support. And the Fed, having demonstrated its willingness and ability to intervene, having proven it can prevent collapse, finds itself trapped. It cannot raise rates without triggering the very crisis it seeks to prevent. It cannot shrink its balance sheet without crashing markets. It has become the indispensable institution, but indispensable because the system it oversees has been warped to require its constant intervention. When COVID-19 strikes in early 2020, the script is already written. Markets plunge. Credit spreads explode. Corporate bonds become untradeable. And within days, the Federal Reserve announces an intervention that makes 2008 look restrained. It will buy unlimited quantities of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. It will buy corporate bonds, both investment-grade and junk. It will buy bond ETFs, essentially backstopping the stock market itself. It will lend to businesses, to municipalities, to nonprofit organizations. There is no limit, no boundary, no asset class deemed too risky. The Fed has become the buyer of last resort for the entire economy. And this time, the money creation is faster, larger, more comprehensive than anyone imagined possible. The balance sheet nearly doubles to $9 trillion. Together with fiscal stimulus from Congress, the intervention injects more than $5 trillion into the economy in mere months. The results are predictable. Markets recover with astonishing speed, reaching new highs even as millions remain unemployed, even as small businesses shutter permanently. Asset prices soar. Real estate explodes. Stocks surge. Cryptocurrencies boom. But this wealth accrues almost entirely to those who already own assets, to the top 10% of households that own 89% of all stocks. The Federal Reserve's crisis response, while preventing economic collapse, accelerates wealth inequality to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The intervention saves the system but hollows out its legitimacy. And when inflation finally arrives in 2021, roaring back after decades of dormancy, the Fed finds itself in an impossible position. It must raise rates to combat inflation, but raising rates too quickly risks triggering the crash it has spent years preventing. It must shrink its balance sheet, but selling trillions in assets could destabilize markets. Every choice involves pain, involves trade-offs, involves admitting that the tools used to solve the last crisis created the conditions for the next one. Because this is the terrible truth that central bankers understand but cannot say. They are not solving crises. They are managing a system that requires periodic crises to justify and expand their authority. Each intervention sets the stage for the next crisis. Each crisis demands greater intervention. The scale escalates. The dependency deepens. What began as lender of last resort has evolved in a market maker of only resort, the single entity standing between the modern economy and collapse. And in this role, in this position of absolute necessity, the central bank achieves something remarkable and disturbing. It becomes politically untouchable. Who dares question the Fed after it saved the economy? Who challenges its authority when the alternative is chaos? The crisis makes the institution essential, and the institution's power to respond to crises makes future crises inevitable. Consider the alternative for a moment, the counterfactual that haunts these institutions. Imagine a decade of stable growth, low unemployment, steady prices, functioning credit markets. Imagine prosperity without panic, expansion without emergency. In such a world, What justifies a Federal Reserve with a $9 trillion balance sheet? What explains its control over the entire yield curve, its ability to create money without limit, its influence over every asset price? In stable times, these powers look like overreach, like a fire department that insists on maintaining a standing army, because fires might someday happen. But we don't live in stable times. We haven't for decades. And this is not coincidence. This is the result of policy choices, of interventions that prevented necessary corrections, of short-term crisis management that created long-term instability. The Bank of Japan learned this lesson first, pioneered the playbook that others would follow. After its real estate and stock market bubbles burst in 1990, Japan's central bank cut rates, bought assets, tried every experimental policy to restart growth. 3 decades later, the Bank of Japan owns more than half of the Japanese government bond market and substantial portions of the stock market through ETF purchases. It has become the dominant player in Japanese finance, the price setter for all assets. And still growth remains anemic, still deflation threatens, still the crisis never quite ends. The intervention becomes permanent. The emergency measures become normal operations. The central bank doesn't solve the crisis. It institutionalizes it, managing a perpetual state of near emergency that justifies perpetual intervention. The European Central Bank followed a similar path after the sovereign debt crisis of 2010. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, each faced borrowing crises that threatened the euro itself. And each time, Mario Draghi, the ECB president, intervened with increasingly creative programs. His most famous moment came in 2012, standing before cameras to declare that the ECB would do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. Those 3 words, that commitment to unlimited intervention, changed everything. Bond yields collapsed. The crisis stabilized. But the cost was the ECB's independence, its credibility, its ability to ever step back. It had promised unlimited action. Markets would never let it forget that promise. This is the trap, the elegant prison that central banks have constructed for themselves. They have solved each crisis by demonstrating their willingness to do more than anyone thought possible. And in doing so, they have trained markets, governments, and citizens to expect ever larger interventions. Anything less looks like failure, like abandonment. The baseline keeps rising. The tools must keep expanding. What was extraordinary becomes routine. Quantitative easing, once an experimental crisis measure, becomes standard policy. Negative interest rates, once unthinkable, become normal across Europe and Japan. Direct lending to corporations, once anathema, becomes just another program. The boundaries disappear. The mandates expand. And the central bank finds itself responsible for everything: employment, inflation, financial stability, asset prices, wealth inequality, climate change, racial justice. Every problem becomes a monetary policy problem. Every crisis demands the Fed's response. But here is what makes this more than just institutional mission creep, more than bureaucratic expansion. It's working. Not perfectly, not without costs, but working in the sense that each intervention has prevented the immediate catastrophe. The financial system didn't collapse in 2008. Markets didn't disintegrate in 2020. Credit kept flowing. Businesses kept operating. Paychecks kept arriving. And so the crisis intervention cycle continues because the alternative, doing nothing, allowing failures and corrections and pain, has become politically impossible. No politician can stand before voters and explain why millions should lose their jobs, their homes, their savings because the Federal Reserve decided to let markets work themselves out. No central banker can justify an action when they have the tools to prevent immediate suffering. The moral calculus is overwhelming. Intervene now, worry about consequences later. And the consequences are mounting, accumulating like debt that must eventually be repaid. Asset prices disconnected from underlying fundamentals. Zombie companies kept alive by cheap credit that destroy productivity and innovation. Pension funds and insurance companies starved of safe returns, forced into risky assets to meet obligations. savers punished by negative real rates that erode purchasing power. An entire generation locked out of housing markets by prices inflated through monetary policy. Political polarization fed by economic anxiety and wealth inequality. Each intervention solves the immediate crisis while planting seeds for future instability. The most unsettling aspect is not that central banks might fail to respond to the next crisis. It's that they might succeed, that they might once again deploy unprecedented tools, create trillions in new money, backstop every market, prevent every failure. Because each successful intervention raises the stake for the next one, trains the system to take ever greater risks, ensures that the eventual crisis will be larger, more complex, more resistant to the old solutions. We are running an experiment in perpetual crisis management, testing whether central banks can keep the system stable through infinite intervention. And the early results suggest they can, but only by making the system entirely dependent on their continued intervention, by creating a financial architecture that cannot survive without constant support. The people sitting in that room in March 2020, making decisions that affected billions of lives, they understood this paradox. They knew they were perpetuating a system that might eventually become unsustainable. But they also knew they had no choice. The crisis was immediate. The consequences of inaction were catastrophic. The tools were available. The mandate was clear. And so they acted, as they always do, as they always will. They saved the system again, postponing the reckoning, buying time, hoping that somehow the future will present options that the present does not. Because this is the ultimate question: what happens when the next crisis comes and the tools don't work anymore? When interest rates are already at zero and the balance sheet is already impossibly large and markets still fall and credit still freezes? What happens when the central bank fires all its ammunition and the crisis continues? Do they invent new tools, even more extraordinary measures? Do they directly monetize government debt, erasing the line between fiscal and monetary policy? Do they buy stocks, real estate, individual corporate bonds? Or do they finally admit the truth that cannot be spoken? That they have fought so hard to prevent failures and corrections that they've made the eventual failure and correction existential? These questions haunt the marble halls and secure conference rooms where central bankers gather. They appear in the academic papers written by Fed economists, buried in footnotes and caveats. They emerge in the late-night conversations, the moments of doubt, the private fears that can never become public. Because to acknowledge these questions publicly would be to undermine the very confidence that makes intervention work. Central banking is fundamentally about trust, about belief that the institution can and will maintain stability. Doubt that confidence, question that authority, and the entire structure becomes fragile. And so the show continues, the performance of certainty, the projection of control, even as everyone in those rooms knows the truth. They're improvising, hoping, buying time, managing rather than solving. History will judge whether this grand experiment in perpetual crisis management was genius or folly, whether central banks saved civilization or merely postponed its necessary reckoning with unsustainable debts, inequality, and speculation. But that judgment lies decades in the future. For now, we live in a system they have created dependent on institutions that have become dependent on crises, watching as each intervention sets the stage for the next emergency, each solution creating new problems that will require even more dramatic solutions. The cycle continues because it must, because stopping would mean confronting the accumulated costs of decades of crisis management, admitting that the patient is not getting better, but merely being kept alive through increasingly heroic measures. What would you have done if you were in their place, sitting in that room in March 2020, watching the world economy collapse in real time, knowing your decision would affect billions of lives? Would you have acted differently, allowed the crisis to run its course, accepted the immediate pain in hopes of long-term health? Or would you have done exactly what they did, reached for the tools available, intervened with overwhelming force, dealt with tomorrow's problems tomorrow? Tell me in the comments. And if you crave more stories that test the limits of truth and power, that explore the hidden mechanisms shaping our world, subscribe, because the next one might just change how you see history itself. The machinery of power operates in shadows, in closed-door meetings, in decisions made by unelected officials that reshape civilization. And somewhere in some secure conference room, another crisis is being managed, another intervention is being planned, another chapter in the story is being written.